Good morning, folks. I think that's everyone in now. So we have a lot of people in this morning. So thank you for joining us. Welcome to our session on procurement risk, what you need to know. I love that title, right? That's going to cover a lot of things, and we'll get big expectations of Sean and Chris this morning. So really looking forward to hearing from our two speakers this morning. And as I said, judging by the number of people who quickly signed up for this session and the current wait list of over 50 people to hear today, I think you also are looking forward to this morning. Procurement risk is a topic that both interests me and concerns or horrifies me, but I am absolutely heartened by the effort and the support that's available to help all of us understand and deal with that important topic. So risk is a key aspect of everybody's life, and certainly a key aspect of public procurement. You all deal with many different aspects of risk, and this risk is just one of them. This aspect is just one. But like all other risks, it's about recognition, it's about considering the risks, and it's about identifying and agreeing mitigation and actions to determine outcomes and therefore minimize those risks. So one of the things, again, I said heartened earlier on, I'm heartened about is there already is an extensive amount of guidance, amount of support and experience available from a range of public partners. The work undertaken by organisations like Police Scotland, the Scottish Government, the Competition and Markets Authority, and many others provides us with support we need to tackle this important issue. Today's session is just one other example of what we're trying to do to provide that support to our wider public family. And we're going to hear from two speakers today. Our first speaker is Chris Gibson. Many of you have met Chris already. Chris is a bit famous or infamous. I'm not quite sure which one it is. You may have already taken part in one of his many fabulous classes in his role as Scotland Excel's Academy L&D project manager. And for those of you who know Chris doesn't do anything by half. Chris is a qualified and experienced secondary school teacher, and I think most of us would just stop there, right? But not Chris. He's also a fully qualified and experienced and practiced lawyer. Chris has been advising on all aspects of procurement for quite some time. Chris, a couple of decades or something like that, even though you look like a wee boy.
Getting
there. Right. So quite some time. And Chris has also been developing and delivering related programmes through the Scotland Excel Academy that I'm sure a lot of you know about, and if you don't, you will. In his spare time, Chris is an artist. I'm embarrassing him now, right? Chris is an artist. He's a gym bunny, right? And Chris is regularly joined by his cat, Drew, right? For most of his sessions, and genuinely, he is genuinely joined by most of his sessions a cat. So I'm warning you now for anybody with cat phobias, and there are a few of you. And to be frank, I do think the cat is the brains behind Chris's work and his success. So over the past months, Chris has also been developing and working with partners to develop a 2-day course designed to raise awareness of serious and organised crime gangs and the risk of that infiltration into public sector contracts and supply chain. We're going to hear from Sean McNabb. I'll introduce Sean when we come to Sean's session. But first, we're going to hear from Chris on serious and organised crime workshop. Before I do that, I want to give us some housekeeping. The standard housekeeping, guys, you've all been through this stuff before. As you'll notice, all your microphones have been muted to avoid creating an echo and all that other stuff that happens. Your cameras are all off. There will be time allocated for questions at the end of the sessions. After Chris's session, we'll be so excited, we're going to take a 5-minute comfort break. At that point, I'll ask you to leave just turn your cameras off or whatever, but come back after 5 minutes. If you have any questions during the session, keep a wee note, or indeed use the chat facility, because I know a lot of people get quite shy. If you use the chat facility, then I'll facilitate the questions from that. when alternatively at the end you can raise your hands and we'll bring you in, and there's guys sitting in the background who will also unmute you and put your camera on, and you can ask your question in person. Today's session is being recorded, and we will make the recording available in the coming days on the Academy, and links will be provided. I know that Chris, in his usual style, will also provide some slides with links and reading material and all that kind of stuff, and links to some of the things I talked about earlier on in the support mechanisms. So, Chris, I'm going to stop stealing your thunder, and I'm going to hand you over to you now. Thank you.
Okey-doke. Everyone bear with me while I share my screen. So, I'm assuming everyone can see it. If anyone can't see it, please unmute yourself and let us know, just so we can deal with any technical difficulties.
So we can see it fine, Chris.
Excellent. It should now be full screen upon all of your screens. So I'm going to look at today a very, very, very high level taster session on how one can start thinking about deterring the infiltration of serious and organised crime groups into our public contracts and supply chains. And as Steve mentioned, we've created, the Scottish Government asked us to create a training session or a training programme. So we've got a 2-day training programme. So I'm boiling down some key elements of that into a wee half-hour presentation with questions for you. So just to kind of manage your expectations in that regard. So this is what we're going to look at. Nice long agenda, but I will jump across and skip across quite a bit of it quite quickly. So first of all, what is the main document, I suppose, that governs us as public sector organisations in Scotland when we're looking at serious and organised crime? So that's the Scottish Government's strategy in relation to it. And then why are you here today? What is serious and organised crime, and what are serious and organised crime groups? And any current issues surrounding them. What have we already done to try and minimise it? And then what does the serious and organised crime landscape look like? You can't know and mitigate against it unless you know what it looks like. The damage that can be caused by SOCG, now that's not rocket science, and I'm sure if you put your thinking caps on, you'd be able to come up with the same stuff that I'm about to flag to you. Then another one that's important for us today, how they infiltrate our public procurements and supply chains. And then which of our procurements and supply chains are perhaps most at risk from infiltration. Finally, ways in which our staff might be elicited or persuaded or influenced to act. And then some internal type audit questions about what you should be asking right at the beginning of your SOCG journey, because I view this taster session as the start of your journey as an organisation or as an individual procurement professional about how to go about minimising the chance of infiltration of an SOC or an SOCG into your procurement or supply chain. So, taking it all the way back to, I suppose, the absolute basics. So what does the Scottish Government tell us to do? They have a strategic vision in relation to SOC, serious and organised crime. So they want to create a safer, fairer, more prosperous country free from harm caused by serious organised crime. And you're probably slightly rolling your eyes there and saying, oh God, another policy objective that we have to integrate into our procurements. And unfortunately or fortunately, we spend so much money via our procurements that they really should be used as a tool to help drive a certain policy. So we've got sustainability, we've got this not new one, but this one that's become into higher prominence, serious and organised crime. Scottish Government have been producing serious and organised crime strategies for a number of years. The first one was back in 2009. That was then built on into our current landscape in 2015. The 2022 one added some nuance to it, some new organisational structures, but didn't change the basic aim of what the strategies are driving towards, which is all about reducing serious and organised crime and the harm that it does to us and our communities. The main thrusts of the strategy which informs how we structure our procurements and what questions we ask and what procedures we put in place, is all about cutting off the markets available to serious and organised crime, and then cutting off the recruits to serious and organised crime and the opportunities that they rely on, that serious and organised crime relies on. So it's about us, the Scottish Government and us, working together with businesses, regulators, our other local authority partners and our other public sector organisations to cut off the opportunities for serious and organised crime to set up or facilitate these quasi-legitimate businesses that they set up. So serious and organised crime don't come in as criminal gangs, but they come in as these seemingly legitimate businesses to try and win our contracts, get onto our local authority licenses, and through those launder money and have a reputable face and hide their illicit activities. The strategy, the Scottish Government strategy since 2015 has been divided into these 4 key objectives. And why am I telling you this? Because it gives us a good hint about what area we're driving towards in our procurements. So the first one is divert. So to divert people from becoming involved in serious and organised crime and using its products. So I suppose front end, back end. And then we've got deter. And given that my title of these training sessions and today's session is deterring, this is the main focus of us. So deterring serious and organised crime by supporting public, private and third sector organisations to protect themselves and each other. So the onus is generally on us to target harden ourselves and protect ourselves from infiltration. So there's only so much that legislation and strategies can do. Detect, identify, detect, and prosecute those involved in SOC. We can definitely help with the identification and detection. And then disrupting SOCGs, preventing them getting onto our procurements and onto our supply chains will definitely help disrupt them. So, in a nutshell, us understanding how to prevent, minimize, or mitigate against potential infiltration into our contracts and supply chains mainly focuses on deter, but through our work, we can help flag up potential SOC organizations. And if we work effectively and don't let them on our supply chains and don't let them into through our procurements, we're hopefully disrupting them because they are relying upon us to allow them on to give them a legitimate facade, so to speak, and some legitimacy. Okay, so what is SOC? So there's a nice definition given in the strategy document about what SOC in Scotland is. So if you Google serious and organised crime, it comes up with different definitions. This is the one that the Scottish Government has decided to choose. It's just got a few more little extra bits in it than the generic SOC, serious and organised crime definition. So it involves more than one person. It's organised, meaning that it involves control, planning, potentially the use of specialist resources. It causes or has the potential to cause harm and involves financial and other benefit to the individuals concerned. And then this last point is SOCG, serious and organised crime groups. So there's lots of different configurations of it. And if you jump onto the other courses, we'll go into a lot more detail about the different configurations of serious and organised crime groups. But for today's session, I want you to get away from the idea that these are gangsters or the Phil Mitchells or the Grant Mitchells from EastEnders, that type of thuggish type of, I mean, I'm sure that is part of it, but for our purposes, you'll come up against it as professionals, professional people, seemingly professionals who run their organised crime group as a business. With all the same type of drivers, many of the same type of drivers as legitimate businesses. It's all about gaining money, gaining control, lowering overheads, except they do it via illicit means. So I wanted just to flag it's professionals rather than the gangster type things. So we need to be aware of these potential internal and external SOCG risks. So you obviously think of the external risks. So they're trying to get onto our frameworks or our contracts. And the external risks, they then in the background will be doing a lot of criminal activities to which might become linked, like human trafficking, child exploitations, various forms of violence, and drug trafficking or drug creation. We also have to be alive to the fact that there are some internal risks for us as well. So we do have to kind of step up and question whether our staff are vulnerable to SOC corruption. And I'm not saying that our staff are corrupt. I'm saying that they might be, if we don't have robust procedures in place, they might become vulnerable to it and be put in a position where they have to somehow act for an SOCG. So all of these things link to deter and divert, so preventing people. So the first one, external threats, deterring SOCG, trying to get onto our contracts, divert, trying to divert by dint of our procedures, diverting our staff from even being potentially exploited by SOCG. So I used this phrase right at the beginning, well, not right at the beginning, but earlier in an earlier slide. So the focus of us in setting up these procedures and running our procurements and running our contract management should be all about target hardening. To the maximum extent possible, we should be promoting a hostile operating environment for these serious and organized crime groups that have tried to set themselves up as these legitimate organizations. And we can target harden and create hostile operating environments, always complying with the rules and regulations that we've got to do. So we can do that when we set up our procurements, when we set up our contracts, and then when we're running our contract and supplier management and doing supply chain management. And that's what the two training sessions are about. How do we go about hardening ourselves to the maximum extent possible and permitted under all of the rules in order to make the operating environment unpleasant for SOCG, so that they cannot bid, or if they do try to bid, that they'll fall off and they'll withdraw because it won't be worth their effort. So in its nub, I suppose that should be all about us gaining and sharing intelligence on these seemingly legitimate businesses and having hostility to such legitimate businesses. And I mean, hostility sounds quite an aggressive word. And I'm not saying we go out and we breach the procurement rules by treating people unfairly or discriminating. That's not what I'm saying. I want to be clear about that. But I'm just saying that word hostility. So using the rules that we've got to the maximum extent to protect ourselves. That's what I mean. We've had some successes. So what have we already done to prevent or minimize SOCGs joining into our supply chains? So we've had some successes already, so we should pat ourselves on the back. But there's a lot of work still to be done, let's be honest. They innovate. If they're like any other business, they innovate to try and get onto our procurement, so we have to innovate ourselves. So just some examples of what we've done in the past. So a few good examples are the Scotland Excel frameworks themselves. So we've got the recyclable and residual waste contract, and we've got the security contracts framework, both of which during their strategy development went through the process of identifying that these are areas that are potentially subject to SOCG infiltration, and therefore mitigations were put in place during the procurement process and during the contract management process in order to weed those organizations out. So for example, recyclable and residual waste, we really beefed up our questions in the tender that required bidders to declare if they had any convictions or sanctions or any recommendations made against them in relation to license breaches. Now, that was particularly, so it was for asking people, have you got a license breach? And then we can maybe exclude them or put them out at that stage, but also, just as importantly, should it come later to light that the tenderer had lied to get onto our contract, we then had authority to remove them from the framework. Okay, so it allowed us to mitigate later if we hadn't been able or hadn't been able to identify them as SOCG or operators that weren't really operating in the correct manner. Similarly, the security framework. Now, interestingly, that was developed in close collaboration with other key stakeholders there, Police Scotland and the Security Industry Authority. All contractors had to be registered on the approved contractor scheme from the Security Industry Authority. And also, the Security Industry Authority and Police Scotland screened potential bidders at the SPD pre-qualification stage. And again, bidders were required to sign this non-involvement declaration, which becomes contractually binding because it's part of their tender, so it becomes part of the contract. So you'll see, and the general gist of the training is you do maximum upfront to try and exclude bidders during your tender process. If you can't, you have enough protections in place you put in place through your contract or through the tender that becomes contractually binding. You make them, make certain declarations, etc., so that should it transpire during the contract management that they've lied about those things, we can get rid of them with relative ease. So that was deter successes. So how to deter serious and organised crime infiltrating our procurements. Disrupt successes. So Police Scotland, the best example of that is Police Scotland sharing lots of information with us, the local authorities, via intelligence assessment disclosures. So that supports us and it supports licensing boards and committees to ensure that SOCGs are no longer able to secure licenses. If they secure a license, they legitimise their business, and it makes it very difficult for us at the procurement stage to put those people out because they've got a license, they've already been vetted by the local authority. So how many of these organisations are there out there? So in 2015-16, the number of SOCGs operating in Scotland was about 150. Other estimates at that point actually egged it up, 196 to 230, involving 3,000, 4,000 individuals almost. Now, luckily, actually, between then and now, there seems to have been a decline. Now, I hope it's not consolidation and the same number of people are together, but they're just kind of operating in more efficient, larger groups. But apparently, now about there's 100 SOCG groups within Scotland, operating within Scotland. 67% of them work in the west of Scotland. 22% of them work in the east and 11% of them work in the north. Now, that follows the population structure of Scotland, so I'm not saying the west of Scotland is more corrupt or anything like that. Interestingly, only 6% of SOC nominals, the people involved in it, are foreign nationals. So it's British people who are involved in SOCG crime for the vast majority of the time. Bullet point 4 there, which is one of the points that I'm trying to kind of just hammer home today. 2/3 of SOCGs groups are involved in the use of seemingly legitimate businesses. So pubs, restaurants, construction firms. So that's a big flag for us. Of these, so there's 100 groups generally operating, but there's these 650 of these legitimate businesses that have links or are suspected links to SOCG groupings. And where, in terms of business sectors, do they find themselves? So there's been research done in the main 5 areas that these organizations fight, that these type of legitimate businesses, quasi-legitimate SOC-linked businesses operate in are property, big flag for us, so construction, facilities management, vehicles and transportation, so obvious one there, taxi firms, Now, I'm not saying all taxi firms are SOC linked, but it's quite an easy business to set up and to look through which to launder money. Service provision and retail, so we'd be interested in the service provision there, catering and food, and then one that probably less relevant for us, health and beauty. So thinking nail farms, nail shops and things like that. Now, our public sector supply chains could involve both primary and secondary SOCG crimes. So, for example, human trafficking, we might be involved in our lower tiers. So it might not be human trafficking, might not be part of the business model, or some form of human exploitation might not be form of the business model of our top tier supplier, the person we put on the contract. But we have to be aware that throughout their supply chain, particularly maybe at the lower levels, so human trafficking might be involved in human trafficking or human exploitation might be involved in that. So we have to do some form of supply chain analysis during our procurement process and supply chain, analysis and again during our contract and supplier management to make sure that nothing else has infiltrated during the contracting period. You might also get some primary, some other criminality right at the top level. So our staff or top tier suppliers could be corrupted or extorted by SOCG in order to get onto the contract or in order to undertake the contract for this top tier supplier. Primary activities of SOCs are those that generate profit for the SOC. So drug supply and distribution, human trafficking, so mentioned that could be involved in our supply chains, financial crimes like fraud, or even those ones that counterfeit goods and things like that, that's a fraud itself. Various forms of theft and acquisitive crime, illicit trade, child sex abuse and exploitation, cyber-enabled crime, extortion, and then various organised environmental and immigration crime. The secondary activities that SOCG undertake are those that they don't generate profits in and of themselves, but they are needed to maintain the SOCG's business model, influence, and its profile. So there we're thinking of things like money laundering. The criminal activity of money laundering doesn't make the money itself, but it cleans the money so it can be reused. And then you've got the violence and the corruption. So those are facilitating crimes that allow the revenue generating crimes to occur. Now, the session would be lacking a severe chunk if we didn't talk about the damage that SOCG can do. And again, the session would be lacking if we didn't talk about the general harms before we move on to the harms that it can cause us as public authorities. So SOCG is damaging to Scotland. And that damage will continue if we don't do our part and try and prevent, as far as possible, SOCG infiltrating our supply chains. So the SOC and SOCGs are all about generating wealth at the expense of law-abiding citizens. It says including the most vulnerable, but one could probably change that to particularly the most vulnerable. So in terms of general economic harms, apparently it costs us, SOCG costs the Scottish economy £2 billion annually. And when you put that into perspective, we're trying to do tax cuts of what, 47 billion? Scotland is a small part of, a relatively small part, a tenth of the population of the UK. So those tax cuts equate to what, £5 billion for us? Think about that £2 billion that's lost. That could be more purposefully used elsewhere. SOC has a disproportionate impact on poorer communities. That's where a lot of the criminality occurs, visibly occurs. But also those people are very much more easily seduced into the lifestyle of SOC because that is seen as their opportunity. For those that aren't dragged into it, it makes their communities much, much worse. There's stigma associated with their communities, etc., etc. Young people can be particularly at risk of exploitation and of harm if they're exposed to SOCG. Legitimate businesses themselves lose out. So legitimate businesses lose out if consumers opt to purchase, for example, counterfeit goods that the SOCGs have produced or created or bought in um, uh, that are not created to the proper standard. Now that allows these SOCG companies or organizations to have an unfair advantage over the legitimate businesses. Furthermore, these sham organizations are set up with a view to laundering money through them. They are not there to create a profit, so to speak, in the way that legitimate businesses are. So these sham businesses, subsidized by the criminal activities, what does that mean? That means that these are legitimate businesses have to go up against these illegitimate businesses. These illegitimate businesses are, I suppose, cross-subsidized by the criminal funding, putting them at an unfair advantage. That can then drive legitimate businesses out the market, making the market overall less competitive for us, meaning we get less good deals when we go out to procure. Legitimate businesses also may be threatened by the SOCG groups, forced to pay protection money, forced to participate themselves, or to facilitate in some form of organised crime. The legitimate businesses also, in order just to compete with these entities, might be forced themselves to adopt underhand tactics just to survive. And then finally, but not finally in terms of importance, public services might be put at risk. We buy shoddy goods, we buy counterfeit goods or goods that aren't up to standard, for example. That puts us at risk that way. Potentially, the supply chain, if it's infiltrated with SOCG, is it more at risk of dropping continuity? So that takes us into this slide, which is the potential damage that could be caused to you and your organization from allowing SOCG into our supply chain. Firstly, think of the reputational damage and the loss to our community if it transpires that we put an SOCG linked organization onto one of our contracts, worst case scenario, or they're found to be within the supply chain of one of our main contractors. Big, big, big problem for us. You can imagine that splashed over everything. We've got the problem of business continuity. So if our supply chain is affected by SOCG, it's less robust or potentially less robust, then there's an increased risk of supply chain failure or supply chain collapse. We're also potentially buying products or services that are of lesser quality than what our specification requires them to be. Things go wrong, we're going to have to remediate the service, get in a new supplier who's going to have to do a lot of work to rejig the service and make good any damage that's been caused. So that services, if we buy shoddy goods and they go a bit kaput, we're going to have to replace those goods. So we're buying the goods twice. We might be faced with some form of fines, depending on our involvement with that organization and what we've ended up doing. And then we've got lots of other costs there, those hidden costs, both internal, external, that will come from any involvement. So diverted time and the cost of staff being diverted away from actual productive work into internal and external investigations about what historically has gone wrong. There might be internal disciplinaries, reviews and processes, changes to our processes, which takes time to draft, and then all the time of training, retraining our staff to make sure this doesn't happen again. How do SOCGs infiltrate our contracts? So the second bullet point there, they use their seemingly legitimate businesses to get onto our contracts or get into our supply chains as a means for laundering their proceeds that they've gained from their other businesses, in inverted comma, their criminality. So SOCG businesses might or those SOCG or those organizations with links to SOCG groups might attempt to obtain contracts from public sector bodies, first of all. So they might try and bid for our work to get onto our contracts, or they might try to obtain contracts from other established businesses. So they might try to operate within the lower tiers of our supply chains of our main contractors. So they may become part of our supply chain if we appoint another legitimate established business to as the main contractor. Hence the reason why not only has COVID forced us to look at our supply chains and ask supply chain sustainability questions within our SPD and within our ITT, but we should be asking those questions of our main contractors to make sure that they have policies and processes in place, to make sure that they've got good policies and processes in place, to make sure that they, in fact, are not bringing subcontractors or supply chain partners on board that have links to SOCG. Also, the other part of the local authority is licenses and permissions. So procurement's one side of it. We don't have any kind of a impact upon, well, we can share intelligence with our licensing people. But one of the easier ways to get rid of SOCG is to make sure that they don't get licenses and permissions. So they will try to infiltrate the public space by obtaining those. That brands them with legitimacy, allows them to get into our contracts more easily. So therefore, our public sector organisations have to be better at weeding people out at the licensing permission stage. Why are we vulnerable? So we're a nice juicy target, so to speak, for these SOCG groups. And why is that? So we first of all procure in several of the sectors that are identified as sectors that the SOCGs might invest in and exploit. So property, transportation, service provision, environmental, so waste management, and security and care. We have the requirement for transparency in relation to what we are going to procure, how we procure, and then running the contract and what we have procured. So that means that these external organizations are really aware of what we're going to procure and can set themselves up for that, and then how we go about running our procurement processes. Now, the note is it's better to have transparency and shine a light on our procurements because it prevents any other bad things going on in our procurement process. But that transparency comes with a little dark cloud to the silver lining, in that it does provide information to this marketplace to allow them to work out how to get onto our contracts more easily. In general, we have to run competitions. We have to treat people equally, fairly, etc. We can't assume that they're SOCG, so we have to allow these people to bid and only be able to exclude them or in certain scenarios, in certain tightly construed scenarios. There is a limited ability of us to exclude organizations, which in the training we'll dig into to a significant extent. There's still the ability to exclude in certain scenarios. And we can, as we talked about, make the environment as inverted commas hostile as possible, hoping that they won't satisfy our requirements or decide it's not worth the effort and withdraw. Our contracts are oftentimes of high value, and we provide a steady, sustainable, secure, and legitimate source of income. They could identify us also as having weak governance, and therefore the ability of getting onto our contracts might be easier. There is also the risk that in this time of lack of or less resources for procurement, and in our ever tightening financial strictures, that we focus on meeting budgets and delivery deadlines. And albeit we're asked to look at the wider ethical and political goals of procurement, they might drop off our to-do list, so to speak. We might then allow in cheaper SOCG organizations that at first glance appear to provide better value, but because we haven't done our due diligence, actually in the end turn out to be a false economy. The use of technology can also increase SOCG infiltration. Is there a risk? So, I mean, the first question to ask yourself if you do your procurement due diligence is, are we in a business sector that's attractive and vulnerable to SOCG? If we're in that business sector, that has to be on the risk register, and we have to put in mitigations in place to prevent our procurements being infiltrated. Second, might there be a distinction between our regulated procurements and our unregulated procurements? Is one more risky than the other for SOCG? Now, regulated procurements can be attractive to SOCG, higher value, longer term contracts, providing steady income. We're forced to open our competition up to everyone, and we've got the difficulty excluding suspected SOCG firms. So that's the risk profile of regulated procurements. So one could say they're a little bit risky. Unregulated procurements, one could argue that they're better because less attractive since lower value. There's less certainty of steady income because it's under 50,000 or under 2 million, so they won't get that steady income. The flip side is that they might think that in these lower value contracts, easier to get onto them because there might be less due diligence and probity checks and things like that. So, but with those unregulated ones, if provided you comply with your standing orders, the more opportunity to exclude bidder, potentially more opportunity to exclude bidders that you suspect of SOCG involvement. So there are risks and benefits of doing a regulated or unregulated procurement in terms of your SOCG risk profile. How might your staff themselves be elicited or pressured or influenced? So staff can be elicited or pressured or influenced to act for your SOCGs due to a number of reasons. So they could be linked to a specific supplier, either directly as a director or via a family or friend. At its most explicit, they could be receiving a bribe in exchange for a contract information, confidential information, money, or some other form of benefit. Again, at its worst, they might be being coerced or forced to give the supplier work or some form of confidential information, allowing them to have an advantage in the bid process. And they themselves actually might have been working independently and have spotted a means of profiting from our tendering processes or our post-tendering processes. And within the sessions, we'll discuss means to mitigate all of that type of behavior. So I want to leave you with just some questions. So like I said at the beginning, this is a taster session to start your journey on how to go about identifying SOCG within your supply chain, potential supply chain, and to start to mitigate. So the questions, if your boss came to you and said, I want you to set up some form of SOCG identification and mitigation strategy. So how confident are you that your organization is not at risk of purchasing goods or services from organizations with links to serious and organized crime? And how have you reached that conclusion? Importantly for us, are your procurement, contract management, and due diligence procedures robust, fully implemented, and being properly followed? Are they regularly reviewed? When was the last time that procurement processes were reviewed? And did they specifically cover SOCG infiltration? You've got those policies and procedures in place. Are you confident that your staff who do procurement are aware of the risks of transacting with such an organization, know how to raise potential concerns, know mitigation strategies to put in place? And does your procurement process protect staff from having undue influence applied to them? So, for example, at its most basic, is there segregation of duties between ordering, order approval, and payment? Few questions of due diligence when you're considering a specific supplier. So, do you have any intelligence that the individual or company is linked to SOCG? Who else is linked to that business that you're looking at to engage with? And are they linked to SOCG? Is there any available open source information out there that you should consider? And then again, in the courses, I provide you with a number of lists of those that you can go and look at. Is the individual complying or the company complying with regulations and legislation in and of itself? Could that non-compliance be an indicator of poor poor compliance, poor business operating models, and therefore an indication of an SOCG company? Is there a risk of being involved in that company? Are the public at risk of this individual company? And is there a reputational risk associated with that company? 2 last slides. How to answer these questions and more. This is my sales pitch bit. Come along to my 2 sessions, the full training session on deterring infiltration of serious and organised crime groups into our public contracts and supply chains. We've got part 1, which is all about raising awareness about what is SOCG, what it looks like, how it can infiltrate in a lot more detail than what we covered off today. And part 2 is all the technical skills. So how do you go through, where in your procurement processes should you be considering SOCG? What tools do you have in order to either exclude, mitigate the potential damage? And also, when you're in your contract and supplier management cycle, what can you do as well then to, if you identify someone as an SOCG risk? So we've got 3 sessions or 3 sets of sessions booked in. 1 in November, 2nd and 3rd of November, which has got limited places left in it. And the new ones that we've just opened up today. They should be on Eventbrite shortly. 1 in January, 26th and the 31st of January, and then the 16th and the 21st of March. And then on the last slide, I think the slides are being shared to you. Well, I'm not sure about that, so don't quote me on it. Some further reading that you may want to go and read. And that's me. Any questions on anything I have highlighted today to kind of, rather than discussed today?
Thanks for that, Chris. Guys, if we could stop sharing, I'll invite the audience to ask some questions. So while the guys are doing that, Chris, thank you very much for that, Chris. That was, as ever, really interesting. I may have poked the dragon here, and there's a lot of questions for you, Chris, so I'm going to try and get through most
I'll
of them.
try and answer some of them.
And in the meantime, if anybody wants to put their hand up, the guys will get you in a queue. But let me start off by a quick observation, and I'll start going through some of the questions that come through the chat, Chris, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I've always been struck by the breadth of the sectors that serious and organised crime gangs are involved in. And I think it's safe to say no area is immune to it. And I know you were categorising them into different areas rather than saying it's construction. We talked some examples, but I think it's safe to say no area is safe. And I know originally we would talk about things like taxis and security. But I read an article fairly recently about, the funeral industry is now, a party to it as well. And I think your point that really struck me was about innovation. We talk about innovation in the wider sector, the wider public family. These guys and girls really innovate, and we need to learn how to innovate as well. So I think it's really important. And I know initially in the chat, I think it was Angela Gray pointed out about the Police Scotland business exploitation document that does set out some of the sectors.
Yes.
But I guess coming back to that point, and I guess what you teach is they're innovating. We need to innovate. We can't just start and say here's a list of sectors to watch for. It's going to change repeatedly. I'm going to start going through some of the questions quickly while we've got hands up. Lynn Robertson, I see actually Lynn's got her hand up, so why don't we get Lynn to ask the question that I was going to ask? Guys, can we let Lynn come in now, please? Lynn, hopefully you can put yourself off mute, and if you even put your camera on, that would be fantastic.
Well, I won't put my camera on. I'm struggling with broadband today, but
that's okay.
Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I've asked a question that I actually don't know if there's an answer to, and I struggled with this in real, like I've had real examples of this. How do we incorporate intelligence about people when it's alleged and there's no proof that they've done anything wrong? How do we exclude them on those grounds? Because I've taken the approach that somebody else has said before and had to ignore it because I felt that we couldn't robustly support it if we were challenged. And I feel like we're, almost sometimes the intelligence is so overwhelming that So the example that I'll give you, it was years ago, we did a combined tender for like small jobbing contracts with the police. So it was when I was in the fire service, and they wanted to exclude some tenderers on the grounds that they had strong intelligence on them, to the point that we ended up not being able to do a collaborative procurement with them because we felt we couldn't exclude them, and they were under no circumstances including them. So I've never really found a solution to it. So I just wondered if there was one.
It is the question everyone asks, because people want to be able to exclude. And at the present state of the legislation and my understanding of the law, so you can, on the basis of pure intelligence that they might have links, you can't exclude on the basis of a criminal activity because there's no criminal conviction.
Yeah.
Under the mandatory rules. Under the discretionary rules, you try and fit them into one of the other categories, so grave professional misconduct. But there's guidance from the English CCS that says that pure intelligence isn't enough. There's nothing in Scotland that counteracts that. So I'm falling in that area that if you've purely got intelligence, it's very difficult to exclude at that point on the basis of like grave professional misconduct. Also, they've got the chance of self-cleaning at that point, even if they've got a criminal conviction, which means they can set up other company, blah, 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 get rid of that manager and move them to another company. So it's very difficult. So the entire training is all about, okay, we should have that right, but we don't have that, or we ideally might have that right, but we don't have that right. So what else can we do? And so it's all about, I mean, it's not a silver bullet in the slightest at all, because it requires to think about how to make the environment as difficult from them as possible, so that either they decide, oh God, this is too much hassle, and they withdraw, or we've got something to hang it on them. The other bit is to mitigate by protecting ourselves in the future. So you say you were forced to bring people on, and that is a scenario that a lot of organizations are in. Oh, this person has done a really good bid. Yeah. We want to get them out because we think they're a bit dodgy, but we can. And if we got them out, they could sue us for breach. So you have to then, it's like upfront, like your good normal setting up your procurements in place, you have to think about, okay, if this were to happen in 2 years' time and they're on the contract, what hooks do we have if we get proper intelligence or we see them doing something? What hooks do we have? So them signing the forms and things like that, and in their tender questions, and then you can make sure that in the contract we've got a right to terminate this contract quickly. There's also other ways that you mitigate by doing short-term contracts or break clauses, or making sure that you've got security of supply by having multiple suppliers, not just your one supplier, to protect your continuity of supply. Okay. So it's not a perfect answer at all.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's really helpful, and that's probably what I suspected. But I did always wonder if there was some other solution out there that I just wasn't aware of. So
I saw some of the chat coming up, and it talked about the legislative provisions, and I think you never know, there might be a change. So the list of exclusions grounds in our exclusion regime at the moment comes from the ESPD, so a European piece of legislation, and we've imported that, and we haven't changed it hugely since Brexit. You never know, there might be an opportunity to change that in the future.
So thanks for that, Lynn. Great question. Thanks. It's a perpetual question, and one that we haven't cracked. And I think I used the term "it isn't perfect." I think we need to make it harder overall in terms of to exclude. Chris, there's lots of questions. I'm going to grab a couple, right? So I thought Craig Smith had a good question, right? We're talking here about some sectors and we're talking about procurement. What about we get further down the supply chain, Chris? Subcontractors, how on earth, do organisations, and kind of linked into most of the questions as well. We've talked about councils a couple of times with, in some cases, reasonable sized procurement teams with a breadth of people in this call, Chris, where maybe there's one person in an organisation. How on earth do we look beyond the primary contractor?
Right, I sit in my ivory tower when I do these training sessions, and say, right, you need some form of question in the SPD about supply chain management and what they've got in, and then as part of that question, you have to ask about SOCG and to make sure they've got procedures in place. And then you have a tender question about their supply management and ask them about how they go about during the period of this contract to make sure that they've got policies and procedures to make sure. So you can ask all that, and you can do at the beginning of your procurement process a full supply chain analysis and identify whether actually, you should be doing that. So, Ivory Tower, first thing, as part of your supply market analysis, you should be doing a supply chain analysis, understanding where every part of your product or service comes from, because your product might at the top not appear to be an area affected by SOCG, but the more that you dig down into the supply chain, one of the limbs of the supply chain could be one of those areas that are subject to, or potentially subject to, one of the enablers, indicators of SOCG. So those are the three things sitting in my ivory tower that you should be doing. Now, you have to, in any normal, it's not rocket, sorry, I don't, forgive me, that's pejorative. You use the same tools as you, yes, David, you would ask the subcontractor to fill out the SPD too as well. Yeah. Use the main tools, the same main tools. So I'm not saying that you have to do this for every single one, but in the same way as you do contract categorization according to your Kraljic matrix or whatever method you use, you would use a matrix or some form of prioritization to identify those areas that you think are most at risk at category strategy development stage. And then that would where you'd put your most resources in order to mitigate and ask those and dig into the supply chain. Again, it's not a perfect solution because we don't have perfect information about all of the things that are going on. We don't have transparency of supply chains enough, and we don't have the staff to get that because we don't have time. So it's not a perfect solution. It's one of those bodge solutions that we can only do so much. But if you choose your if you analyze your categories and do the main work there, then you mitigate the majority of the risk, hopefully.
So, Chris, I'm going to ask you another question I don't think you have the answer to, right? But just emphasising how difficult this is. So, I think it was Angela Gray talked about, what about unregulated quick quotes? You know, what do we do about that as we see the challenge in resources overall and using some of these really good tools like quick quotes? How do we prevent some of these situations occurring when we go down that route?
I mean, that's interesting because they're smaller contracts. So therefore, so it's not like entering into a longer term contract where you're tied in for 2 or 3 years or 4 years and you're putting someone in a framework and you're really dodgy about that and don't want to give them the money. So they're shorter value contracts. So their risk profile from that perspective is less because these organizations, the organization versions of them might be, they're less attractive to them because they keep having to bid and bid and bid. So they might not want that. So they might not want to bid. You've also at that lower level, you're not subject to the ESPD rules. So you can, I believe, act more upon intelligence. And if you think someone, or you've been told by Police Scotland, or they've got links, you don't have to invite them to bid through the quick quote. So it's not like an open tender. So there's more flexibility there with unregulated to exclude, because you're not bound by the SPD or any of those type of rules. Your standing orders might have just adopted it all, which you're tied, but then you can get an exemption to your standing order. The other risk, though, is the flip side is that you might not do as much due diligence at those low levels, accidentally allow someone through, but the flip side is it's a smaller contract and you can get rid of them quicker.
So I think what you're saying, Chris, this is a really difficult area, isn't it? And the last thing I'm going to highlight, I guess Derek McLean made a really interesting point about, we have a number of areas across the public services that are quite narrow markets, and maybe something like waste, in terms of the supply base on it. And Derek was asking other efforts about tackling those areas as opposed to individual procurement exercises. Probably rather than ask you to answer that, Chris, I would say probably I think from my own experience, one a good example would be waste. And if we think of some of the things that's happened, the involvement of SEPA, I think was it last year there was a documentary on it and showing some of the things in Scotland. So there's certainly recognition of some markets. I think it would be dangerous to focus on single markets, but it's a good question from Derek, because going back, people innovate.
Yeah.
So,
well, from memory, I do know that the task force is focused on certain sectors for periods of time.
yes.
And they've adopted not the low-hanging fruit, but not the obvious ones, but like you said right at the beginning, they're very adaptable, and any area that they see as potentially exploitable, they'll move into.
Yep. So I think, there is no silver bullet in this. It's not perfect. We've got to, just work it and keep going.
Yep.
Chris, I'm conscious we're a bit over time now, folks, and folks, I've allowed this to go because I think actually it's really interesting, and judging by the number of questions, Chris, and in actual fact, Chris, it's not only questions that are in the chat box now, it's tips. Good. So that's fantastic, folks. That's the kind of thing we want to see, where we're sharing some of that knowledge and experiences. And earlier on, a message that, Chris would be delighted to receive any emails from you about experience or examples and things like that. That would help us in our education of the wider public family as well. So folks, thank you for that. Thank you for those really interesting questions. Chris, thanks very much. Chris, I'm not sure whether you drew on your experience as a procurement professional, as a lawyer, or as a secondary school teacher, right? But I think you've done a really good job of bringing all those together to give us a real thought-provoking overview of that. And I know you'll be providing some information on the classes and things that you're running. Yeah. So Chris, thank you very much. Folks, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to start back at 11:10. Folks, we are running a wee bit over. I'll keep going, and maybe we might overrun. If we get some time back, great, but if not, I'll just keep it going later on. Okay, folks? So straight back on, 11:10, start. Thank you, folks. So thank you, Chris. Found that really, really interesting. And we're going to move on to our next speaker now. I was reflecting again on Chris's update. And, when he mentioned a certain Phil Mitchell, and I've still got the EastEnders boom, boom, boom in my head, right? That's not who we're up against here, folks. And I think that's what Chris was emphasising, because it's not about I think the phrase Chris used was gangsters. It's about that serious and organised criminal. It's about people who think bid rigging is appropriate. It's about cartels. It's about these illegal practices that are damaging our economy and our society. We're going to hear now from Sean McNabb from the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA. Sean is currently a director in the cartels team in the CMA. His background is a fraud investigator, and he's been involved in cartel enforcement for over 20 years, having previously worked at the Office of Fair Trading. Sean worked on a number of successful criminal and civil cartel investigations involving a diverse range of industries, ranging from airlines, estate agents, furniture products, and various sectors of the construction industry, including leading the largest ever cartel investigation in the UK, which resulted in fines totaling £63.6 million being issued to over to 103 construction firms found to have engaged in bid rigging with competitors on building contracts, including many within the public sector. Sean is currently a project director for an ongoing investigation into alleged anti-competitive activity in the construction sector. And folks, when we stop to consider the level of spend that we all, as a public family, undertake and influence in the construction sector alone, think how relevant Sean's experience and session will be today. I'm going to hand over to Sean now. Sean, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, Robin, who's going to negotiate the slides for me. So it's really good to be here today, and thank you very much for inviting the CMA to talk here today. There was some definite overlaps between what I'm going to talk about in terms of cartels and what Chris talked about in terms of serious organised crime. That's something that we have come across in our experience in investigating cartels too. And some of the industries that Chris mentioned are definitely ones that we have seen we have seen cartel activity in as well. So that was really interesting to hear Chris's talk. So if we just move to the next slide, please, Robin, if that's okay. Thank you. So first of all, just a little bit of background about the Competitions and Markets Authority. For those of you who have not come across us before. So we are the UK's primary competition and consumer authority. We are independent from government. We are what is described as a non-ministerial government department. And we came into being in 2014, taking over from the Office of Fair Trading, where I previously worked, and the Competition Commission. We have offices all across the UK, including new offices in Edinburgh as part of the government hub, and our work covers a lot of areas. We have responsibility for carrying out investigations into mergers, markets, regulated industries, and enforcing competition and consumer law. And one of the main things that we are tasked with is the enforcement of the law concerning cartels, which is seen as one of the most serious types of anti-competitive activity and is a key priority area for the CMA. Next slide, please, Robin. So the central aim of today really is just to highlight and raise awareness of the risk of bid rigging in public procurement and to help you understand more about what illegal cartel behaviours in relation to procurement might look like. I'll point you in the direction of the red flags to look for in your procurement processes, which might indicate potential bid rigging is taking place. And I'll also cover some of the steps that you can take to reduce the risk of your procurement exercises becoming subject of bid rigging. I'll talk a little bit about what we actually do in terms of tackling cartels, including our powers of investigation and some of the previous cases that we have successfully prosecuted. I also want to mention our willingness and interest to work in partnership with external partners, such as local procurement teams and fraud teams, and who are on the ground and most likely will be the ones who will come across the type of activity that I am talking about today. So I'll also signpost where you can get more information about bid rigging and how you can report concerns and suspicions to the CMA. And this is a key message I really want to get across today, namely that if you do come across something which you think might be illegal or suspicious, that you do contact the CMA. So I'll explain how you can report your concerns to us so that we have the right information to consider taking forward an investigation. And obviously, there will be time, hopefully, for questions at the end of the talk. Next slide, please, Robin. So what do I mean by cartels? Well, it's worth dealing with the common misconception that people have when we mention the word cartel. It often conjures up a particular association in people's minds of drug trafficking in South America. But the cartels I'm obviously going to talk about today are a very different type of criminal activity. They are much closer to home, cartels, than people think, and involve ordinary businesses colluding and conspiring to rig outcomes in their favour. They are, in essence, anti-competitive agreements between businesses who should be competing with each other, but instead they are getting together to rig the market in their favour, and they are ripping off customers, often forcing them to pay higher prices for poorer quality goods and services. And they also harm honest businesses who are working hard to succeed in what are challenging economic times. We've seen them in all sorts of sectors of the economy. We see them a lot in construction. We've also seen them a lot in medicines, pharmaceuticals, estate agents and financial services, airlines, furniture components, and even among professional model agencies. And I was interested in Chris mentioning funerals, taxis, nail bars. These are all sectors that have cropped up in our consideration of cartels. Next slide, please. So the CMA sees bid rigging as a key risk in public procurement, which in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, is economically very significant. Scottish Government has bold and ambitious plans for Scotland's future, and its procurement plans play a critical role in supporting those aspirations. Through taking a distinctive approach to the pursuit of inclusive net zero economic growth, the Scottish public sector is using its considerable procurement power of £13.3 billion to focus on the singular goal of delivering for Scotland. And that 13.3 billion of procurement spend is supporting around 11.8 billion of economic activity and around 120,000 full-time equivalent jobs, contributing around 6.5 billion pounds to the Scottish GDP. So procurement spend with Scottish suppliers has also gone up, and spend with suppliers based in the most disadvantaged areas of Scotland has also gone up. So if you consider the large sums that are being spent and will be spent through public procurement in Scotland, and that bid rigging has been estimated to inflate prices by at least 20%, then the potential harm from any bid rigging becomes evident. And it is harm that is felt throughout society by taxpayers and by all of us who use public infrastructure and services and who are denied the benefits of competition. So therefore, it's important that we are on high alert to the risk, and why we in the CMA have been talking to a lot of people about the dangers of bid rigging. Next slide, please, Robin. So since the CMA's creation in 2014, we've been investing in our capabilities to ensure the effective enforcement of cartels. And this includes ensuring we have the people, the tools, the procedures in place to uncover cartels and to progress our cases as swiftly and effectively as we possibly can. And we've started to see the results of that work in the past few years. In the last 2 years, we have issued fines of over £76 million against companies involved in cartels. We have the power to fine companies up to 10% of their worldwide turnover if they are found to have broken the law. There's also been action taken against individuals. 24 people have been disqualified from acting as company directors for their role in a cartel, and 2 people have been given criminal convictions. And it's also worth noting that businesses can face damages claims by third parties, including by government, who would argue that they have been the victims of cartel activity. And this is an increasingly significant aspect of cartel enforcement in the UK. Previously, it was generally an American issue, but it's now increasingly common in Europe and the UK that the companies found to have been involved in the cartels are being sued by the victims, who have usually ended up paying higher prices. And reputational harm can also be an issue for those companies found to have engaged in cartel activity, not only in terms of the negative publicity for the companies and the individuals involved, but there can also be significant consequences in terms of being debarred or excluded from future public sector tenders. But yet, despite these dangers for businesses, competition law risk remains low on boardroom agendas. Just 18% of those businesses we polled said that they had senior level discussions about it, and it trailed far behind issues such as health and safety and employment law. Next slide, please. So there are therefore, excuse me, serious consequences for both individuals and the companies who engage in cartel activity. But not only are the consequences serious, the risk of getting caught is very real. We have strong powers of investigation, which will allow us to take action where we have reasonable grounds to suspect cartel activity, and reasonable grounds to suspect is a relatively low evidential threshold. We have powers to turn up with a warrant and search company offices unannounced and seize documents, including electronic material. These are what is known as dawn raids, although ours normally start at about 9 a.m. We can search the home addresses of those suspected of involvement in cartel arrangements. These searches do usually start a bit earlier in the morning, just to make sure we get the people still at home. And we can interview people either using compulsory interview powers or on a voluntary basis. And we can compel companies and individuals to give us information and documents. We also have strong powers to gather intelligence of suspected wrongdoing, meaning that we are able to use a number of techniques. First of all, surveillance, including following and monitoring suspects and covertly recording conversations and meetings. We can use informants or covert human intelligence sources to obtain information for us, and we can pay rewards to our informants for providing information up to £100,000. And we can access communications data to gain evidence. So, for example, we can obtain mobile telephone records of suspect individuals. The fact that we have such strong powers of investigation is a measure really of how difficult secret cartel activity is to uncover, and an indication of how seriously the impact caused by cartels is measured. Our intelligence capabilities mean that over half of our cases are intelligence led. In our investigations into 2 cartels in the construction sector, which I'll mention later, meetings of the cartel were covertly recorded by the CMA and used as illegal evidence of cartel conduct. Next slide, please. So, as I've said before, what all cartels have in common is that they undermine competition and essentially cheat customers and other businesses of a fair deal or a fair level playing field. Effective competition helps ensure value for money, better choice, quality, and innovation. And there are 3 common types of cartel conduct where companies get together to collude to rig things to their advantage. First of all, agreements between competitors to fix prices, such as agreeing what prices they are going to charge, and this could be in the form of target bands or agreeing not to discount below a certain level. You've also got agreements between competitors to illegally divide up a market between themselves. In other words, agreeing who will supply which customers or which areas. And then thirdly, you've got agreements between competitors to rig bids for contracts, such as agreeing who is going to win a competitive tender and at what price. And today, I'm going to focus on bid rigging and the types of cartel behaviour that you're most likely to encounter in procurement. Next slide, please, Robin. So bid rigging comes in a variety of forms, and all are designed to manipulate the tender process to the contractor's benefit. It's important, obviously, for procurers to recognise these practices so that they can stay alert to them and spot where they might be occurring. Some of the most common bid rigging activities, which may occur together in more sophisticated cartels, include bid rotation, where firms agree to take it in turns to submit the lowest bid or the most attractive bid on a project, thus ensuring that they all have a fair share of the market. You also have bid suppression, where companies agree not to submit a bid at all, which means other firms face less competition to win the contract. And we have seen this done in exchange for some kind of kickback or compensation payment, or as part of an arrangement where the winning bidder will subcontract part of the work to the non-competing firm. And then you have cover pricing, where companies that don't want to win the work will communicate with their competitors to submit inflated cover bids to ensure that they don't win and that another often pre-arranged bid from another company looks much better value. And this gives then an artificial impression of what is a competitive price. And again, just to say, we've got a big job to do to get the message out about how serious cartel activity is. In a recent survey we did, which I mentioned, we found that around half of the businesses didn't know that discussing the pricing of tenders with competitors was against the law. And given the serious consequences of breaking the law, that's perhaps a worrying statistic. And in other research, as I previously mentioned, it has been found that bid rigging can cause serious harm, inflating prices by at least 20%. So the stakes are high, both for those tendering for contracts and for the organisations putting them out to tender. Next slide, please, Robin. I'm now just going to go through some of our recent cases and just shine a light on some of the key bits of evidence to highlight the sort of cartel conduct that goes on and which great corrupt suppliers will go to great lengths to try and conceal, although unfortunately for us, not always successfully. You can read more details on all of these cases via the case study tab on our Cheating or Competing campaign page, which I'll obviously point you to later. The first case which I want to talk about is one that involved a Scottish business who were fined for an illegal information exchange which took place at one single meeting. We uncovered a cartel involving the 4 main suppliers of galvanised steel tanks who were getting together to fix prices, share out customers between them, rig bids for contracts and exchange commercially sensitive information. The companies involved were fined £2.6 million, although one company escaped a fine as they were the first to report the cartel through our leniency programme. Towards the end of the cartel, a representative from a Scottish company called Balmoral Tanks, who were a new supplier who had recently entered the market, was invited to a meeting with the main cartel members. And the purpose of the meeting was to invite Balmoral to join the cartel. Although at the meeting, the representative from Balmoral refused to join the cartel, he stayed in the meeting and joined in a discussion about his company's general approach to pricing and what they would quote for certain tanks, discussing what would be a reasonable price band for particular tanks. This sharing of non-public commercially sensitive information was illegal and against the law. It gave Balmoral gave Balmoral's rivals or their competitors an idea of their pricing strategy, which reduced uncertainty in the market and could have helped the other suppliers in their own pricing strategies. And as a result of that, one single meeting, Balmoral was fined as a result. This case and the concrete drainage case, which I'll also mention, where one of the parties was a Northern Irish firm, demonstrates that geography is no barrier to the CMA pursuing a case. We aren't England or London centric. We will pursue cases across all of the UK nation. And the quote on the slide was taken from one of the cartel meetings. And obviously the answer to the question was that it was not worth the risk because we happened to be covertly recording the meeting. Next slide, please. A recent bid rigging case we did was in the office fit out sector, where several businesses were cover bidding for bids to fit out and refurbish offices. There was often a cartel instigator, that is a company who provided the others who were tendering with cover bids, giving them completed costs and or design plans for them to submit as if it was their own bids that they had prepared independently themselves. The company's cover biddings meant that the clients missed out on the opportunities to get the best possible deal. We fined 5 of the companies involved, a total of over £7 million. And in each case, the fine was increased because one or more of the directors of the companies were directly involved in the cartel conduct. The CMA secured the disqualification of 6 directors of the companies involved in this particular case. This is just an example of some of the evidence we uncovered in the case. The first email is an internal email in one company from an estimator to his managing director, where the estimator has prepared an inflated bid for the managing director to send to a competitor and to tell them to make it look like it's their own bid. And in the second email, which is between 2 competitors, one is basically telling the other to submit a rubbish quote to give the appearance of a competitive tender. And in bid rigging cases, we see this type of evidence regularly, either in the form of emails or chat messages on phones. Next slide, please, Robin. Another very recent case was the cartel we uncovered in concrete drainage products, which I mentioned, and which are of crucial importance to large infrastructure projects. And this was a case that I was lead investigator on, and which had a direct impact on the Scottish market. We fined 3 construction firms more than £36 million for breaking competition law. The cartel lasted over 6 years and involved them fixing their prices, sharing the market by allocating customers to each other, including in relation to tendering for contracts and exchanges of commercially sensitive information. The cartel involved the senior executives from the companies meeting in secret away from business premises in hotel meeting rooms. And 4 of these meetings we were able to covertly record. And in these meetings, you could see the rivals discussing detailed price lists, which customers and which contracts belong to who, and how to maintain their market shares. And one of the four meetings was specifically arranged in order to discuss the Scottish market, because the cartel felt that prices in Scotland were too low compared to the rest of the UK, and they needed to do something about it. One member of the cartel kept the track of all the discussions in what he called his boys' spoils files, while other referred to the arrangements by the code word the Pigeon Club, clearly recognising that this was not an ordinary business practice. And this quote from one of the meetings indicates sort of the level of cynicism of the cartel. That was why one of those involved received a criminal conviction, and the 5 directors involved were all disqualified, one for a total of 12 years. And when they talk in the slide here about numbers, what they are in fact referring to are their company profits. Next slide, please. So a case I'm currently leading on involves the demolition sector. And this is our most current case involving bid rigging. The first thing I must say, obviously, is that the case is still ongoing. We have not issued our final infringement decision yet. So unfortunately, I am a little bit limited in what I can tell you about the case. However, what I can tell you is that following an investigation launched in late 2019, we have provisionally found that 10 firms engaged in bid rigging on 19 contracts worth over £150 million for demolition and asbestos removal works, and that it is our current intention to impose financial penalties on those companies for their involvement in the cartel. The contracts involved were mainly in the southeast of England, such as the Met Police Training Centre at Hendon, Bow Street Magistrates Court and Bow Street Police Station, but also the Selfridges store in London and offices in the South Bank. But there are also contracts in Coventry and in Oxford. And we also know that some of these companies involved are present in the Scottish market. The investigation was large in scale and complex. A total of 15 companies were investigated, and we had at least some evidence of bid rigging in relation to well over 100 contracts. We executed search warrants at 13 company premises, and we seized large volumes of documentary and electronic material, which we needed to sift through and analyse. And we also conducted interview with those individuals suspected of involvement. What we found was that bid rigging took place with the deliberate intention of deceiving the customers into believing that they were receiving competitive bids when this was not in fact the case. The bids were rigged through the practice known as cover bidding or cover pricing, which I referred to earlier, whereby the firms agreed to deliberately submit high or inflated bids to ensure that they don't win the tender and that another bidder would win the contract. As a result, not only is the customer deceived, but they can end up paying higher prices. Clearly, if you as a bidder know that you're not facing any competition, the temptation will be to put up your prices. In addition, we have provisionally found that a number of firms were involved in compensation arrangements, whereby the designated losers of the contract, that is the ones who submitted the cover bids, were to be compensated by the winning bidders. The value of the compensation paid varied, and it usually depended on the value of the contract. But in one instance, the compensation payment amounted to more than £500,000. And we have found evidence that tender bids were inflated in order to pay the compensation owed to the losing bidders. 8 of the firms have admitted their participation in the bid rigging and the compensation payment arrangements. 2 companies are still contesting our provisional finding, and we are currently going through the process of considering their representations on the matter. Once we have considered and taken into account the representations, the next stage would be to move to issuing a final decision which would impose financial penalties on those parties found to have infringed competition law. At the moment, although this is still subject to change because the process is ongoing, we anticipate a final decision before the end of the calendar year. Next slide, please. So what can you do to reduce your chances of being a victim of bid rigging? And there are 4 steps that we would generally recommend. First of all, be aware of what bid rigging is and be alert to the fact that it does exist and it does happen. Secondly, design and manage your procurement processes in a way that reduces the risks of bids being rigged. And thirdly, recognise the red flags, the kind of suspect activities and patterns of behaviour that might suggest bid rigging is taking place. And finally, know how to report suspicious activity to the CMA, and I'll obviously point you in the direction of how to do that. As I've said, we very much want and encourage people to report concerns and suspicions to us. The worst thing to do from our perspective is that if you do have suspicions or concerns, that you approach the companies or confront them yourselves with those concerns. This has happened on a few occasions, but really this only just tips off the companies that you might be onto them, and it makes our job to investigate and obtain evidence to support your concerns harder. So therefore, we would encourage you to please speak to us first should you have any suspicions of bid rigging. In terms of the red flags to look for, there are a list of these available on our cheating or competing campaign website. They include things such as when bid prices drop on the entry of a new or infrequent bidder, or when you see similar wording, spelling mistakes, or calculation within competing tenders, or where you see the same increment between bids. For example, all respective bids increase by 5%. I'm not going to go through all of them today because obviously I'm conscious of time, but when you do, if you do get a chance, I would encourage you to please look at them on our website. I can tell you that we have seen all of them featuring in our cases. I appreciate none are a silver bullet to confirm that bid rigging is taking place. They are just common sense things to look for in your tender processes. And all we would ask that is if you do see one of them, to stop and think about whether it was what you were expecting and whether it raises some suspicions in your mind. If it does, or even if you're not sure, then again, we would very much encourage you to speak to us. It may be that we already hold some intelligence or information about a particular industry or particular companies, which might be relevant and links to other suspicious behaviour that we have seen. It's also obviously well worth collating data over time and benchmarking with previous projects and with other procurers so that you have a good idea of what the right price should be for particular products and services, and to help you spot any anomalies or suspicious behaviour in particular tender exercises. And one other thing that is probably worth drawing to your attention is that there are some factors in our experience that tend to make cartels more likely. As I've said at the start, we have seen cartels in a broad range of industries, but common factors in a large number of them are where there are a relatively small number of firms competing in an industry, or there are generally the same firms regularly bidding against each other in tender exercises. Another factor is where it's a homogeneous product or service involved, and where the main way in which the companies will compete with each other is through price. And it's also generally accepted that corruption and fraud risks increase in times of change or crisis. And this is no different with bid rigging. In our experience, a lot of the cartels that we have uncovered have started as a result of difficult economic circumstances. And we are obviously currently in the midst of difficult times with a recession, global supply chain issues, Brexit, and a war in Ukraine. So there is therefore an increased likelihood for cartels to come into existence as companies seek to protect margins. And finally, a common factor in cartel cases is where there are already opportunities for the competitors in an industry to meet with each other. Are there already channels of communications open between competitors? And this could be at events such as trade shows, conferences, golf days, or perhaps there is a trade association where competitors regularly meet. We all know that even if you go to a social event with people in the same business, at some point, you're probably going to start talking business. So always ask yourself whether the companies you're dealing with already know each other. Next slide, please, Robin. As I've said, it's important that you design and manage procurement processes in a way that reduces the risks of bids being rigged. poor procurement design can increase the likelihood of bid rigging, and this will generally be where it makes collusion between competitors easier by limiting the number of eligible bidders, for example, as part of limited processes intended to speed up the procurement process, where it limits the number of eligible bidders through restrictive pre-qualification criteria, or where it favours incumbent suppliers, for example, by placing too much emphasis on criteria such as experience or firm size, or where it creates predictable cycles of procurement through stable and recurring demand. Obviously follow the best practices, I'm sure you do, and ensure you're familiar with the Scottish Government guidance on procurement processes. Some practical steps on what to do are outlined on the slide, but I just want to specifically mention one, which is don't be afraid to let your suppliers know that you're being vigilant for signs of bid rigging. Tell them that you are actively monitoring bids and that you will report any suspicions. Include a link to CMA information in tender documents and obtain signed declarations of non-collusion from the parties. It will at least put them on notice, and it will make it easier for you to sue for damages at a later date if you're found to have been a victim of bid rigging. Next slide, please. I mentioned at the start that the CMA is very keen to work in partnership with public procurement organisations, both in local and central government, to combat fraud in procurement processes. We recognise that we cannot take action against cartels without the help of partners, and we regularly exchange information and intelligence with other law enforcement agencies, regulators, government departments and international competition law bodies such as the International Cartel Network and the Five Eyes communities. For example, we also have an MOU with the Crown Office here in Scotland. We're always seeking to build on that partnership working, and we have been developing links with procurement, local procurement teams and local fraud teams to share intelligence and data. You're the ones who will come across the suspicious behaviour that we have been talking about today, but we also receive a lot of information which may be relevant to you about companies or individuals working in your area, which may assist you. At the CMA, we have a strong intelligence function, which is fully compliant with the National Intelligence Model. We also have a strong data science team, and we are developing cartel screening tools, including working with international partners to develop an effective bid rigging screening tool to help improve the identification of potential collusion between bidders. And we are seeking access to procurement data, ideally where there may already be suspicions of collusion, to enable us to continue to test and refine that tool. So obviously, if you would like to know more about that, then please do not hesitate to get in touch, as we would be delighted to hear from you. Next slide, please, Robin. At the CMA, as I've already mentioned, we have advice available on our cheating or competing campaign page. We have a dedicated section on there for public procurers, which includes a new free e-learning tool designed specifically for public sector procurers. Plus, elsewhere on the page, we have animated videos that explain illegal behaviours and various guides and case studies. So please do have a look at that if you get a chance. Next slide, please. And finally, it's really important that you know how to report any suspicions to the CMA. And as I've said a number of times, please do contact us if you do have any suspicions in relation to any of your contracts. What you've seen or heard may not seem much, but it may feed into other information or intelligence that we have or concern that's been raised by others about a particular sector. We will take your suspicion seriously, and we do have strong powers of investigation to take action. You can email us, you can call us to talk to us, and there's also an online reporting form. I think that's me done. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, and happy to try and deal with any questions that you may have.
Sean, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting, and unfortunately we've really went over time, but can I ask you, we'll save any questions from the chat and we'll get them to you and we'll respond to them, Sean, but can I ask you a quick question based on one of your last slides there? You talked about data. You know, in Scotland we've got some fantastic data, really good work by Scottish Government over the past years through our Scottish model. We've got a wealth of data. You talked about kind of suspicion-led data analysis. Have you considered, or are you doing any proactive analysis of the totality of data that we have to consider other areas that we should look at that might not have suspicion in?
We are doing a proactive program in terms of internally, where we're using a sort of strategic analysis to identify those sectors beyond those that we already think there are suspicions. We're doing proactive analysis of sectors of the economy that we think are prone to cartel activity. So this is based really on, to an extent, on where international partners have seen cartel activity, but also looking at some of the features that I talked about. So, for example, where there are a limited number of players in the UK market, or where there's a homogenous product, or where they're going through challenging economic times. So we are doing that proactive work to try and identify sectors that may be prone to collusion. And then what we're doing is targeted outreach work to relevant procurers in those particular sectors to see if they may be able to share information with us in terms of data or any particular concerns that they may have that they maybe thought weren't concerns at the time, if you know what I mean.
Okay, Sean, thank you for that. Folks, at the start of the session, I talked about the wealth of talent, experience and information we have in the public family. So signposting is really important. So I think one of the guys is maybe going to put up a slide now. We'll share all the slides. I think I mentioned in the chat, all slides and outstanding questions will be shared via the Academy in the coming days. There is a wealth of information, and here we go now. Great, thank you, Robin. So there's just some examples of some of the elements that we can signpost you to. The support overall. Chris earlier on also mentioned about the 2-day programme that we developed in conjunction with a number of partners, including the Scottish Government and Police Scotland. The programme is scheduled, I think, Chris will correct me, I think there may be 2 seats left in the next programme and then that's full. So you've got the next 10 minutes to get your name in if you want to try and get those last 2 seats. And there's a schedule for subsequent dates as well, because I think it's something we'll be running on an ongoing basis. I guess I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to both Chris and Sean for a really informative couple of sessions. It's really got us thinking. As said earlier on, that it's both intriguing and worrying, but I do sincerely believe we've got a lot of talent, a lot of experience, and a lot of support to help people. It's a big challenge. So thank you to you both for your informative sessions. Thanks to all the delegates, record-breaking numbers. Apologies for the timing again, but most of you have stuck with us, so thank you for that. Everything will be provided. You'll be emailed over the coming days with any further information and links to the signposting, the slides and any other further information you need. So I think that's all, folks. So just to say a final thank you all for attending today. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.